Just thinking a little bit about memes after watching Gary's video again, and also about meat. So I want to try and make a video that brings together meat and memes, or at least, yeah. I guess because the connection occurred to me, which is to do with this thing I've been talking about the last couple of videos about meat, to do with, you know, whether it makes sense to not believe in meat or not. By which I mean, as I said in the last video, this word we have in English, and I know it's not the same in other languages, this word we have in English, meat, which seems to point to a real thing in the objective world, is a social and linguistic construction. It's an invention where we've artificially carved out a section of the world, given it a name, and then awarded it some kind of objective status in a way that, you know, real objects seem to carve themselves out. That's the thesis. In the last video I gave a couple of examples of other things that carve themselves out, and I was wanting to do other ones, some more examples, because I'm still not entirely happy with the other examples of concepts like meat. So I talked about snow in Inuit populations, talked about consciousness and self, talked about something else, I can't fucking remember. But I think other examples exist. When I got a comment from Elena43 talking about this, and had a little exchange, and the other examples we came up with, I came up with the idea of femininity. I mean, it's not a substance, you know, but it's a word that we understand. It has a conceptual significance to us. We know what we think we know what we're talking about. But, you know, everybody knows that that's a really unstable and fragile concept, highly contested. So in what way does that exist? It exists because it's socially constructed largely, and socially constructed in different ways according to which bit of society you have to be sitting in. So that was one. The other was colours, which I thought was really great. There's a word in the Welsh language, I think, which is the name for a colour that lies between grey and green. Not Graham Greene the author, grey and green. And you know, it doesn't feature, at least regularly within the English language, but it just carves that piece of the spectrum out and gives it a name. And there was a response from, I think it was from Alenkos, who said that in Sanskrit there's 300 different words for the colour blue, or 300 different shades, you might say. In which case, again, here's this spectrum of colours. No one's denying its existence, no one's denying the wavelength of light that's doing the bouncy offy thing and into your eyeball thing. All that's happening. But if you're a Sanskrit reader and speaker, then you're conceptually carving that set of wavelengths up differently, bounding each of those little fragments up in different ways, giving them different names and owning them as different concepts. And I know it does have a real effect. There was some studies done a couple of years back, because I think Russian does the same thing with blue. I think there's a number of different words in Russian for different shades of blue. And there was some real tests done, I think. I'm sorry, I really can't remember the details. If I find them, I'll let you know. But it was just testing the speed at which speakers of different languages could match different colour swatches. You know, like you'd see a bunch of swatches on the table of different shades of blue, and you had to pick out, or something like that, to pick out the two that were the same colour, or something like that. And there were very subtle differences between them. And for people who had who spoke a language and had a conceptual language going on, which contained names for some of those colours, they were much faster at it. Presumably because they're kind of labelling these colours and then comparing the labels, and like playing Snap, you know what I mean? You're not having to do the this wavelength's like that wavelength thing if you haven't got a label for it. Okay, so there's that. Carving up the world in different ways. And I should just say that I'm not arguing for any kind of hard Whorfian analysis here. You know, Whorfian is or Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as I understand it, is this idea that there's basically only language, and you experience the world according to language. Kind of 1984 where you change the language and you change people's reality. That's too... no, that's not correct, really. But there is a wiggle room between that and kind of interactive relationships between the world that we experience and concepts and the language we have to label that world, for sure. Okay, so staying with that. Okay, it's just staying with language for a minute, because I do want to eventually get to meat and memes. But because Because there are some funny ones in other languages. I mean, obviously colours is pretty readily available to all of us. But I know that there are languages, and this is something George Lakoff talked about, which break up the world in ways which are completely alien to English speakers, certainly. There's one language, and I can't remember the name of the people or the language, which has a particular category which is represented in the language in the form of a suffix or a prefix, something like that, which carves out women, fire and dangerous things. That's the name of the book it's in, Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. So in that language, those three aspects of the world are somehow carved out and combined into a single conceptual entity. Now it's not stuff, it's not, you can't point to a piece of women, fire and dangerous things on the ground, but as a concept it exists in a way that I just can't get at all. But it exists. Women, fire and dangerous things. Okay, what else? I did have another example actually, but I can't remember it. Oh well, I'll just go on to memes in that case, because I think memes is also an example of something that's a bit like meat, because memes are right on the edge of being substances, I think, but also right on the edge of being completely mythical and being metaphorical or poetic. Because when Dawkins came up with the idea of the meme in the book of Selfish Gene, years ago now, 20 years ago probably, maybe more, he first came up with it as an analogy. It's a classic piece of analogical thinking, and the power of analogy to drive creative thought. He was thinking about, what is an idea? How do people get to know things? How does education work? How do ideas spread through populations? Those kind of things. And by analogy, he looked across at genes. How do genes spread? How do physiological and physical traits, biological traits, spread through populations? They spread through genes. So he borrowed that whole structure and reimagined it as in the world of ideas. And so you get memes. But he was always a bit cagey about that, And in his early stuff, in the Selfish Gene, you're not quite sure whether he's writing about something he really believes have material existence, or whether they are, as I say, just kind of metaphors. And since he wrote that, he's backscuttled quite a bit, really, and he's very much taken the metaphor line. It's just a metaphor, it's just an analogy. Of course, ideas spread. I have an idea and I tell you, and you have that idea and you tell someone else, and then you write it in the book and it exists in the book, and then someone reads the book and there it is, But all of the language that we use around it, when we're using the language of memes, to do with spreading and to do with reproducing, is metaphorical and analogical. And other writers have used kind of plague metaphors, that language is a kind of virus from outer space, as Laurie Anderson says. But as I say, Dawkins has retreated quite a bit from that, and although he does use it for sure, he's very clear now that it's analogical. Other writers, like Susan Blackmore, I'm less so sure about it. I think she really believes it. And she may be right, That's the interesting thing about memes. They may well have at least some kind of physical instantiation. There was some work done a few years ago by Gerald Edelman, neuroscientist, in this book called Neural Darwinism, where he's talking exactly about that. He's not talking about ideas, he's talking about neuronal patterns of connection. And what he argues there is that there are neuronal patterns of connection in the brain which form, but the forming of those patterns and the establishing and reinforcing and firming up of those patterns happens through something like genetic processes, something like Darwinian processes, struggles for survival. He basically says, it's something like when a kid's learn to pick up a glass of milk, a small child. Typically they do this with their arm, they'll make their arm will go out like that and they'll knock it over a few times, and eventually the movement will refine itself. He says what's going on there is that the brain is producing lots of neuronal firings, lots of sensory motor activities going on to do something to do with the arm, and something to do with that general direction. And all these middle movements of the arm are reflections of those competing and conflicting signals. And the ones that are successful, the ones that are reinforced, because the kid's presumably watching what's happening and the parents are saying be careful and the milk is either being drunk or not being drunk, the actions that are actually being reinforced eventually win out, and those wirings become hardwired, and the unsuccessful neuronal connections don't get reinforced, so they cease to fire. So you get this neural Darwinism going on. It's the same thing when you learn anything. You know, the example I had recently I was thinking about, because my kids just learned to drive, and you know, learning to drive in reverse. You know, once you've got the hang of it, it's dead easy. You know, you put your hand on the back of the seat and just do this, don't you? It's really easy. The first few times you do it, it's really weird. You know, you don't quite know what to do with the wheel, and all your timings are off. And it's the same as that feeling of reaching for the milk. But after a few goes, you know, your own visual feedback of knowing what you're doing kind of reinforces the right action, reinforces the right neural connections, and there you are, you know, reversing into your drive unproblematically, because presumably all of the kind of bad networks of connections, the bad sensory motor signals, the bad muscle movements have been selected out of the population, and only the strong ones that do the job survive. So the reason why I'm saying that is that, you know, there's something like, if there was something like memes, it would be something like that, I guess. It would be something like that. But even then, you know, it's not great. And actually calling it neural Darwinism, I think, is a bit deceptive, because as Dawkins himself, I think, points out somewhere in terms of memes, if there is anything genetic about mimetic processes, if there is anything in the idea of memes, it certainly isn't a Darwinian process. It's much more like Lamarckian, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So it wouldn't be Darwinian, it would be Lamarckian, or Lysenkoian, or something. Anyway, the reason, God, it took a long time to get there, sorry about that. But yeah, the reason why I'm saying that is that, you know, this idea of the meme, does it exist? Is it a real thing? Is it a real pattern of neuronal firings? That's maybe the case from Edelman's work. And if it is it truly separable from its context, from the actions and the environment which produced it, reinforced it, pruned the surplus away around it? Is it truly one of those? And if so, is it a bit like meat in that sense? Or is it just metaphorical? Is it truly a poetic idea, an analogy thrown up by Dawkins to allow us to think about something? And is meat more like that? Is meat an idea that we've put together to allow us to think about things like, ooh, that's tasty, I'll have that, and allow us to not think about other things like, ooh, that's in pain, I better not eat that. I don't know. Anyhow, I can't think of, actually the only other example I've just thought of, just occurred to me as I looked out on this lovely Cheshire landscape in winter, is there it is, the horizon. Does the horizon really exist? Look, there it is, look, look. How foolish would I be to say there is no horizon? How foolish would I be to say I don't believe in the existence of the horizon? That's stupid. Until you go and try and take a close-up photograph of it, of course, then you're fucked. Or until you try to show on a map where it is, or until you try to measure it, or until you try to explain to someone on the other side of the planet why your horizon is a horizon and their horizon isn't. Yeah, that'll do.